This is a re-recording of a presentation by David Chandler prepared for the Turning the Tide conference in Washington, D.C., September 12, 2025. Some of my colleagues who have done much of the heavy lifting on the World Trade Center research have tried to discourage me from getting involved researching the Pentagon. The Pentagon research contributes little to our overall understanding about the nature of the 9/11 events, and it has become a wedge issue to divide the movement. However, ceding the argument to the various factions that push the claim that all the evidence is faked discredits the truth movement as a whole. It leads to one rabbit hole after another. Scientists for 9/11 Truth believes it is important to look at the hard evidence, take it seriously, and see what it has to tell us. If we are really a truth movement, then it is our job to rigorously seek the truth. We need to resolve this issue. The central question that divides the 9/11 truth movement is whether or not the Pentagon was hit by American Airlines Flight 77, flying from Dulles Airport with passengers on board. If it was not hit by a plane, or if it was not hit by that flight, it hardly matters what alternative mechanism caused the damage. Passengers got on that flight at Dulles. What happened to them? If we assert that Flight AA-77 did not hit the Pentagon, then the story becomes much darker than it already is. Did passenger DNA end up in the Pentagon or not? Yes, it did. And there was a major effort involving over 1,000 people and multiple agencies to search for and identify the human remains of the victims, just as was done for the World Trade Center. Finding the evidence to establish whether the Pentagon was hit by a plane, a large plane, or a 757 have been intermediate research goals, but those are mere stepping stones to establishing whether it was actually Flight AA-77. DNA was found for all but one passenger, including 5 unknown persons of Middle Eastern origin, 2 of them being brothers. An interactive graphical database which can be run on a Windows PC called PentagonScene.exe was put into evidence in the Zacarias Moussaoui trial. That is the source of the image shown here. I encourage you to search out that program and explore the data. Another key to identifying the plane is the Flight Data Recorder, or FDR, which traces the flight all the way from the Dulles Airport to the Pentagon. One of the things we will look at is why it is reasonable to conclude that this data is authentic and why it is unreasonable to conclude otherwise. Overlapping radar records obtained from multiple agencies, both military and civilian, give complete coverage of the flight, even though the transponder was turned off. These sources agree with each other, with the FDR data, and with the vast majority of eyewitnesses. This map shows the location of just a few of the many eyewitnesses to the flight path of the plane that hit the Pentagon. Many of them testified to seeing the actual impact and described the plane. Frank Legg, an Australian scientist and 9/11 researcher who died in 2016, compiled a list of public statements from 188 eyewitnesses. Others have compiled similar lists. Other evidence of the flight path and impact can be found in the external and internal damage path. Any other theory than Flight AA-77 being the plane results in declaring some or all of this evidence to be faked. The problem is the claims of faked evidence weaken the argument, and the claims of fakery themselves need to be proved. Once you start throwing out inconvenient evidence, the logical problem becomes, what then are you going to rely on to prove your own alternative theory? Here is a compilation of eyewitness testimony taken from the Pentagon plane puzzle by Ken Jenkins.
Over 180 witnesses are on record describing what they saw at the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. 127 witnesses said they saw a large plane.
Tell me exactly what you saw.
I saw a plane going down, big plane, commercial liner type, going down full speed and just inside the side of the Pentagon. It was a big plane.
I saw a large airliner-sized plane.
It looked like a big-sized plane. It was definitely a passenger plane.
That's a huge airplane.
26 witnesses identified the plane they saw as an American Airlines plane. 7 witnesses identified the plane they saw as a Boeing 757.
A huge airplane, looks to me like a 757 American Airlines.
I saw it was an American Airlines 757.
It was a Boeing 757 American Airlines, no question. 757.
When I looked up, I see this plane, it's a 757.
There was a jet, what looked to be an American Airlines jet, probably a 757.
It was an American Airlines plane that came in and hit the Pentagon.
It was an American Airlines jet. You could read the AA on the side, silver fuselage.
63 witnesses saw the plane impact the Pentagon.
It looked like a commuter plane, 2-engine, come down from the south, real low, proceed right on and crash right into the Pentagon.
Plane went west to east, hit the west side of the Pentagon.
And I saw it hit.
Slammed right into the building, huge explosion.
The next thing we saw, that airplane crashed in the Pentagon.
13 witnesses saw the plane hit one or more of the 5 downed light poles.
I looked up and I saw this American Airlines jet coming in very low, and I watched it, and it clipped, I don't know if you can see it over here, it clipped this pole, and I saw it clip these poles.
4 witnesses saw the plane hit the fence and generator trailer.
Evidence can be circumstantial, testimonial, forensic, etc. The strongest evidence by far is direct physical evidence, hard evidence. My approach is to take the evidence seriously, especially the hard evidence. This doesn't mean we should believe everything we're told. It means we don't start with the arbitrary assumption that anything touched by the government should be discarded. The government is a huge bureaucracy. The vast majority of government workers do their specialized jobs honestly and competently. Even if we believe there was government involvement in the planning and execution of the 9/11 events, the number of people on the inside of that plot would be very small. This means we need to evaluate each piece of evidence on its own merits and use our discernment to determine validity or whether there are signs that it was tampered with. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, in its original incarnation, an organization I was proud to be a part of back in the day, focused strongly on hard evidence at the World Trade Center and rejected speculative theories such as no planes, space beams, holograms, video fakery, missiles, and mini-nukes. That's how we gained traction and gave a solid foundation to the demolition hypothesis. Those fringe elements of the movement are still out there, by the way. I can't get off their mailing lists. AE provided intellectual discipline and scientific leadership in the investigation of the World Trade Center. AE made a conscious choice to declare the Pentagon to be out of scope for its own investigations because the dominant expertise of its members was buildings. The downside of this decision is it left the Pentagon question open to become the Wild West, where speculative theories were allowed to flourish and be promoted uncritically. Speculative quasi-research discredits the movement as a whole and allows the public to ignore the solid work we've done, especially regarding the World Trade Center. One of the earliest instances of 9/11 skepticism was put forward by Terry Masson, pardon my French, I don't speak French, who published a photograph of a small garage door-sized hole in the Pentagon and declared that this hole was too small for a large plane to enter. The meme that the hole is too small spread like wildfire, and it became an article of faith in the early 9/11 truth movement that no plane hit the Pentagon, or at least certainly no big plane. The hole seemed to fit a missile or something else small. It turns out that Terry Masson's small hole picture had been cropped away from its context. What we are looking at here is the whole photograph. The small hole was an opening in the second floor with about 100 feet of first floor damage beneath it, being obscured by fire hose spray. What Terry Masson did not show were 2 other pictures by the same photographer on the same roll of film just a few clicks later that showed a broad swath of damage on the ground floor. Notice that this is an early photograph before the roof collapsed, so this is impact damage, not collapse damage. Why Terry Masson selected a single misleading photograph and not the ones that gave a more complete description of the damage is a question worth asking. It is not that the more complete view was not available, it was simply not shown. In a very real sense, we are here today still arguing the basic facts about the Pentagon event because of false information that took root in the movement early on. Starting in 2006, Craig Ranke and Aldo Marquis, calling themselves the Citizen Investigation Team, or CIT, promoted another theory, claiming that the plane flew along a different approach path north of the Citgo gas station that bypassed the row of downed light poles and then flew over the Pentagon, obscured by a massive synchronized explosion as cover. The flyover they described as a grand magic show, fooling the eyewitnesses into believing the plane hit the building. The main upshot of their theory is that since the plane, in their view, never actually touched anything, every bit of physical evidence at the Pentagon had to have been staged. That puts their theory beyond the reach of any critique based on the physical evidence at the scene. What would have to be faked went far beyond the downed light poles. They would have to fake the radar reports from multiple sources, the contents of the FDR, the damaged taxi, the notch taken out of the generator trailer, the notch taken out of the top of the tree on the overpass, the shattering of another tree beside column 16, the massive internal damage with a directional flow to simulate a plane passing through the building, breaking and bowing columns all along the way. They would also have to fake the clear signs of impact damage to the exterior surface of the Pentagon beyond the broad first floor opening, and an exit hole punched into the inner wall of the C-ring with plane debris spilling out. As Ken Jenkins and Frank Legg asked years ago in a short but insightful paper, why not use a plane? I came into collaboration with Frank Legg as he was analyzing the evidence-based flight path and the alternative claimed by CIT. What he showed me was that the radar path, indicated here by color-coded symbols, the flight data recorder path, indicated by the yellow line, the exterior damage path from the overpass bridge to the Pentagon wall, indicated by short red lines, the interior damage path, and the C-ring exit hole were all in perfect alignment. When Frank Legg showed me this diagram of those features, that is what got me off the fence about whether the plane actually hit the Pentagon. That was the beginning of my Pentagon research journey. Another influence from even earlier was Jim Hoffman's composite photograph of the damage to the Pentagon wall. No one photograph shows the whole extent of the damage, but if the views are pieced together as a mosaic, they show an opening where the impact by a large plane becomes plausible. As Frank Legg put it, the opening was large enough for all the heavy parts of the plane. The wingtips had to deform and be pulled into the building, but there was evidence that they did just that. Wayne Costi has since accounted for the damage caused by the right and left wingtips. The right wing slapped the building, causing breakage of columns 18 and 19, which can be seen here. The brakes pushed the columns inward, which is a clear sign of impact. Some people assert that all of the Pentagon damage was from explosives, but that claim is simply not plausible in this case. Column 18 survived because the wing impacted it at the point where it was reinforced by the second floor slab, which had greater strength because it was hit edge-on. Since the plane was coming in along a line 51 degrees from the Pentagon wall, the right wing essentially paralleled the wall, allowing it to virtually imprint itself on the exterior surface. Since the plane had a strong northward component to its motion along the wall, that's down and to the right in this image, the right wing was dragged along the wall and into the opening. The left wing was a different story. It was angled sharply away from the wall, so the wing plowed along the wall, breaking one column at a time. The left wing broke successive columns until it met column 9AA. By that point, the plane had been slowed a bit. The less massive outer end of the wing met the column. Column 9AA was left unbroken. It was stripped of most of its concrete and severely bowed in the direction of motion, but the fact that it was not broken shows the wing was blocked from doing damage any farther along the wall. The wingtip was not lying in the rubble outside the Pentagon, so it had to have been dragged in. Column 9AA was hit near its midpoint, which tells us the left wing was horizontal as it entered the building, so the entire left wing entered on the first floor. However, around columns 11 and 12, we can see the second floor slab was impacted. Since the left wing was entirely underneath this slab, the only thing sticking up to damage the slab was the tail of the plane. The tail broke the beam at the edge of the slab and dragged it down, allowing the bricks around the windows to fall away as shown here. The offset of this damage from the point of entry of the nose at column 14 was due to a horizontal rotation caused by the early asymmetric impacts to the right wing from the generator trailer in the south wall. The fact that the tail damage did not extend farther up the wall tells us that the tail, which angled backwards, was also dragged in like the wingtips. Some asked for evidence of the massive engines. The engines did indeed have very strong titanium components, but the engines were assemblies of components that broke apart during the multiple impacts with columns inside the building. Here's a collection of plane parts, many identifiable as belonging to a 757, from Ken Jenkins' video, The Pentagon Plane Puzzle. Let us look now at the alternative approach path promoted by the CIT group. Craig Ranke of CIT interviewed Ed Pack at his car repair shop on Columbia Pike west of the Navy Annex. Mr. Pack's testimony was that the plane flew overhead toward the Pentagon. The CIT story is that the plane diverted from there to go around the north side of the Citgo gas station before flying over the Pentagon at the nominal impact point. The problem is that at the speed of the plane, the time from the repair shop to the Pentagon was only 5 seconds. There was no time for that maneuver. CIT imagines the plane banked left, then rolled and banked right to go around the Citgo station. Frank Legg and I independently calculated the required bank angles for this high-speed maneuver. It was on the order of 80 degrees. The corresponding lateral g-forces would be on the order of 10 g's, which would be unsurvivable by the plane or the people inside. Also, the roll time from left bank to right bank would be entirely impossible in that 5-second time frame. Frank and I published 2 papers about this research. The north of Sitco flight path, when paired with Ed Pack's testimony, is simply impossible. I've analyzed the testimony of two of CIT's key witnesses in great depth. You can find these interviews and analyses on my site, 911speakout.org. Albert Hemphill watched the whole event from an upper-story window in the Navy Annex, overlooking the Pentagon impact site. Sergeant William Lagasse was at the Sitco gas station. Both witnesses testify that the plane passed through the light poles and went into the Pentagon. Frank Legg calculated that if the plane touched any of the light poles, it would be too low to pull up and fly over the Pentagon. The red line in this picture is Albert Hemphill's line of sight. He described the plane as coming over his right shoulder. That would put it south of the Sitco station, consistent with the physical evidence. When asked if the plane was as far south as the VDOT radio tower, that's the Virginia Department of Transportation, by the way, he estimates it was probably not that far. That answer does, however, imply he was seeing the plane to the south. Some have tried to interpret Hemphill's statement as saying the plane crossed over his right shoulder, but went north of the Sitco station and curved back to the entry point. But like Ed Pack's testimony, the tight curve of this path would require impossibly large bank angles and g-forces. By the way, I've created a little graphical program where you can play with different path curvatures on this map and directly read out the bank angle and lateral g-force. There is also a link on my website, 911speakout.org. From Albert Hemphill's location to the Pentagon wall was only 3 seconds of flight time. Hemphill saw a flash of light as the left wing of the plane hit the second light pole, and he described exactly where the plane went into the building. CIT, however, claims Hemphill as a north of Sitco witness, based on a single misstatement in an hour-long telephone interview, a statement which Hemphill later corrected. Sergeant Lagasse was interviewed by Craig Ranke at the Sitco station in 2006, 5 years after the event. The most detailed documentation of the interview was CIT's video called Pentagon, released in 2007. For my analysis of the interview, see my written and video commentary at 911speakout.org. The CIT witnesses give testimony that is wildly divergent from any of the other witnesses. I think it is important to try to understand why.
But these were the light poles. This is where the taxi cab was, right here, not over here. Nothing happened over here, period.
Much is made of Sergeant Lagasse's supposed identification of the plane's path leading to the Pentagon as north of the Sitco station. But this is contradicted by his insistence that the plane passed through the light poles and actually hit the Pentagon. Sergeant Lagasse insists the light poles and taxi were somewhere other than where they were. The problem is he had misdrawn his estimated flight path on a biased photograph with strong perspective that made the light pole flight path unrecognizable. But in the follow-up conversation, he insisted that the light poles and the damaged taxi lay along the path he drew. In other words, it is clear the line he intended to draw was the one that passed through the light poles. A full discussion of this interview is available on my website, 911speakout.org. This is the photograph Sergeant Lagasse and the others were given to draw the path. Note that the light pole path, which has been added in red, was actually inclined 51 degrees from the Pentagon wall, but in this highly misleading photograph with strong perspective, it looks more like 10 or 15 degrees. Sergeant Lagasse refused to acknowledge this as the path with the light poles when Craig Ranke pointed it out to him. When Lagasse drew his own line, you can hear him say the angle didn't look right. Here is an unbiased overhead view of the scene. The Pentagon is on the right, the Navy Annex on the left, and the Sitco gas station is highlighted in the middle. From above, the angle of the light pole path looks right. If this were the view Sergeant Lagasse were shown, he may well have chosen the light pole path. He was very conscious of the angle the sketch of his path made with the Pentagon wall, and the light pole path has the correct angle. Craig Ranke kept framing the question as where the plane was when it passed the Citgo station. But that was not Legacy's focus. According to his own testimony, Sergeant Legacy was under the canopy of the station, facing south, talking with his dog in the car when the plane passed, and it passed in a fraction of a second. His initial encounter with the plane would be auditory, sudden, unexpected, and very loud. His initial experience of the plane would most likely be a startle response, reacting to the loud roar. What he actually saw visually about a second later was the plane approaching the Pentagon. The plane relative to the Pentagon was his point of reference, and that's why after drawing his line he said the angle was wrong. It is interesting to note that when the CIT guys presented their results to the public, they transcribed all the paths drawn by the witnesses to an overhead view Google Earth map. Why the switch? Would the witnesses have drawn these same lines if they had the overhead view map to start with? By the way, none of these CIT witness paths are physically possible due to the bank angles and lateral g-forces. CIT cherry-picked their witnesses, artificially framed the questions rather than allowing free responses, then cherry-picked the testimony given by their witnesses. We will hear more from Sergeant Legacy later. Let's shift our attention to the final approach path from the overpass to the Pentagon wall. There are 5 light poles, a traffic camera pole, a tree on the overpass, a large generator trailer from the Pentagon refurbishment project, and a low concrete retaining wall. Each of these objects has scars from the incoming plane. The first and third light poles were hit solidly by the right wing and fragmented. However, the second light pole was bent and knocked over at the base, but not cut through, indicating it was skimmed by the left wingtip. That gives us a precise location of the plane. The tree on the overpass has a circular notch cut out of the top, leaving twigs that are stripped, like it was scooped out by a dull blade. The camera pole has a scar and a missing rung, indicating it was hit by the right wingtip. If you do the measurements, the distance from the second light pole to the camera pole scar, measured perpendicular to the flight path, exactly matches the wingspan of a 757. Also, the position of the notch in the tree is exactly where the right engine of a 757 would have passed. A 757 matches the damage. Any other size plane or missile does not. Let's move to the generator trailer and the low retaining wall, which were near the Pentagon wall. The notches found in the generator trailer and retaining wall exactly match the spacing of the engines of a 757. Again, a 757 matches the damage, a 737 or any smaller plane does not. The kicker here is that if you consider the 3 points of contact at the overpass and the 2 points of contact near the Pentagon wall, the line connecting those 2 clusters of impact points precisely matches the direction of motion given in the flight data recorder. In other words, the FDR contains real data precisely matching the facts on the ground. There's another source of information about the plane traveling along this approach path, namely the imagery from the 2 security cameras at the entry to the parking lot. The plane is a small fuzzy image near the edge of a distorted wide-angle video frame. Can you see it? Here it is again, but with the plane outlined in yellow. Is this what you saw in the previous slide? Here's a zoomed-in view. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. The plane can be made more visible by blinking the frame containing the plane with the previous frame that lacks the plane. Can you see it when it blinks into view? Your eye is adapted to notice change. This is a trick astronomers use when looking for objects that move slightly or change brightness in a crowded star field. There's more about this in my video of Seeing the Pentagon Plane, which you can find on my website 911speakout.org. Here is a blink view from a second camera nearly parallel with the first. Notice the obstruction in the foreground. In this view, the plane is behind the obstruction. Can you see the tail sticking up? Notice the longer smoke trail. It's an extension of the previous shorter smoke trail. One feature of the plane images crossing the lawn is a cloud of white smoke behind the plane. That's curious because the plane exhaust normally does not involve white smoke. But keep in mind that the right engine had just scooped out foliage from the top of the tree on the overpass. This burning material can account for the unexpected smoke trail. Let's move on. Here's the next frame of the video, 1 second later. The plane has disappeared. Now what do you see? In preparing for this talk, I saw this image with new eyes. This is one of the original 5 frames leaked in early 2002, so it has been around for a long time, but I never looked at it quite the same way as I did a couple weeks ago. You can all see a fireball at the wall of the Pentagon, but do you also see a thin, smoky streak across the lawn? This is the smoke trail that was following the plane, and we can still see it after the plane has disappeared. This reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, where the Cheshire Cat disappears gradually, in the end leaving only his grin. Alice says, "I've often seen a cat without a grin, but never a grin without a cat." This thin smoke trail is like the grin without the cat as the plane erupts into a fireball and crashes through the Pentagon wall. We are not seeing the plane stop short and blow up somehow on the Pentagon lawn, as some have suggested. We are not seeing it rise up and fly over the Pentagon, as others have suggested. We can see the streak of smoke leading right from where we saw it last into the fireball itself. Remember, the source of the smoke is the tree. The streak of smoke is evidence of a continuous path from the tree in the overpass through the trail of light poles to the impact point on the Pentagon wall. The thin smear of smoke is a record of the plane's motion in between the 1 second frames, transforming what is essentially a slideshow into a vivid representation of the motion of the plane. We don't need to invoke pre-planted explosives to account for what we are seeing. We are seeing the fireball from the plane breaking through the wall. We have the testimony of an eyewitness who was a certified explosives expert whose job was handling a bomb-sniffing dog. He witnessed this fireball and testified very clearly to what he saw. He was interviewed by Craig Ranke at the Citgo gas station, directly across from the impact point. This is free-form testimony from Sergeant Lagasse when the conversation was not being controlled by Craig Ranke.
0% chance it was a missile. 0% chance it was a Global Hawk, which is a new one.
No bomb that was thrown into the building.
Yeah. Like I said, detonation versus deflagration. Yeah, there was an explosion, but it was not a detonation. It was a deflagration. And all the junior scientists out there can figure that out. I'm an explosive detection canine handler. I know about explosives. I've seen enough of them go off when we blow up our own training aids for tests and for demos. It wasn't a detonation, it was a deflagration.
He said, 0% chance it was a missile. 0% chance it was a Global Hawk. No bomb. Detonation versus deflagration. There was an explosion, but it was not a detonation. He said, "I am an explosives detection canine handler. I know about explosives. It was a deflagration." And he repeated that statement several times. A deflagration without the physical impact of the plane could not have created the hole in the Pentagon wall. A detonation from high explosives, however, propagates supersonically, creating a powerful shock wave that can do real damage, and it produces a distinctive, sharp, percussive sound. That distinctive sound was missing, so Sergeant Lagasse's testimony contradicts not only the CIT flyover theory, but all the theories that have been put forward other than large plane impact, since all the other theories require explosives to carve out the observed damage in the Pentagon wall. Here is what a true explosion looks like. Explosives cause a supersonic expansion of gases with sudden onset, expanding instantly to maximum size, creating a shock wave that breaks things and produces the distinctive cracking sound. Here, by contrast, is a deflagration, a slowly developing fireball of burning jet fuel. A deflagration is a fireball that expands gradually, producing no shock wave, and billowing out over a period of several seconds. Now look more carefully at the early frames following the impact at the Pentagon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The cameras were filming at a frame rate of 1 frame per second, so these views are at 1 second intervals. This is a slow, billowing growth of a fireball of flammable material over a period of several seconds, not a supersonic blast front. This is a classic deflagration, as Sergeant Lagasse observed and recognized due to his training. We are seeing a plane crash into the Pentagon, pure and simple. The burning fuel comes from the plane. The smoke trail comes from the tree on the overpass. It all hangs together. We are seeing what Sergeant Lagasse described. I said earlier that the FDR was in alignment with the radar and damage path data. But there is a caveat. The FDR takes sensor readings of many things going on in the plane, multiple times per second. One of the measurements gives the direction of motion. This is a direct reading and is highly precise. Another set of data is the position of the plane in 3 dimensions. However, position is not a direct reading. The inertial guidance system measures the small changes in the position and calculates the current position by adding up the small changes. Each term in this sum has a small measurement error, and in summing up the terms, we get cumulative errors, producing what is known as data drift. In practice, in the pre-GPS era, readings from ground stations along the flight path would be used to correct the data drift. At the time of impact with the Pentagon, the computed path had drifted a bit to the north, but the direction of motion remained precise. We can correct for the drift by dragging the FDR path while keeping it parallel with the original until it aligns with key markers on the ground. When Frank Legg died, I had been working with him and was left with his calculations. I didn't know the exact offset he used to bring the FDR path into alignment, so I decided to do it from scratch so I could understand the basis for his calculations. Okay, here is the vicinity of the Pentagon shown in Google Earth. The Pentagon is here on the right. I've constructed a plane here the size of a 757. I've actually done this twice. I have the 757 and the 737 as 2 options. Let's stick with the 757. If I take the nose of the plane, here's where the engines would be and here's where the wingtips would be. These direction lines indicate the direction of motion as indicated in the flight data recorder. I can take the actual positioning and move it around because there's data drift and we would need to correlate the position with the facts on the ground. Here is the path of the plane as computed by Frank Legg, and it goes through the hole in the wall of the Pentagon and has the direction of motion indicated in the flight data recorder, the same as these. Okay, if I move the plane to Frank Legg's track, notice that it clips the second light pole substantially. It should have broken the light pole if this were the case. Down here, the right wingtip misses the camera pole. This shadow here is the camera pole shadow, and the base of the pole, if you come straight up vertically toward the viewer, is where the scar would be. So my hypothesis was that the wingtip actually created the scar. So I put it through the base of the camera pole, and what do you know? The left wingtip touches but does not substantially impact the second light pole. The second light pole was found down here on the lawn, bent 90 degrees and knocked over, but it wasn't broken. Notice also I have constructed here with these little arrows this point, which is the location of the notch in the tree. I did this by comparing this view with a side view and locating where that notch actually was. And notice that if I position the plane so that the left wingtip just skims the second light pole, the right wingtip skims the camera pole, the right engine, which is this orange line right here, passes right through the notch in the tree. If I project using the direction of motion indicated in the flight data recorder, I come up here to the features that are close to the Pentagon wall. This is the generator trailer right here, and notice that the right engine goes through one end of the generator trailer, and the left engine goes through this retaining wall over here. This is a concrete feature, and there's a retaining wall at this edge of it, and that impacts correctly. So by positioning the plane as I've done here, I get 5 points of contact just by positioning 1 point exactly. So I could basically just take the plane and put it so the left wingtip passes through the second light pole, and I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points of contact that are correctly shown on this assumption. If I did a 737, I have a smaller wingspan. Notice if I position that so that the left wingtip just touches the second light pole, which is required, by the way, to see the second light pole bent but not broken. Notice that the right wingtip does not come anywhere near the camera pole, and neither engine, the right engine here, does not go through the notch in the tree. So it does not fit. So a 737 does not fit the evidence. 757 fits it perfectly. Here's a close-up view of the scar and missing rung on the VDOT camera pole. Here's the second light pole lying on the ground with a 90-degree bend and knocked over but not shattered by the wing. It was clearly grazed by the wingtip. So this is the path of the plane that best fits the physical evidence. It fits better than on Frank Legg's original attempt. Whereas the previous positioning of the path accounted for the damage approximately, the adjusted path accounts for it precisely. What made these 3 points near the overpass align perfectly with the 2 points near the Pentagon wall was the direction of motion recorded in the FDR. In other words, the alignment validates the authenticity of the FDR data. If the direction of motion given in the FDR were off by even a degree, the alignment would not match the facts on the ground. There's further validation in the last data entries, where the circumstances of the actual impact are recorded. The FDR records the entire flight. If the FDR data near the Pentagon is shown to be valid, that means the total path given by the FDR is also valid. This means the flight path is continuous all the way back to the Dulles Airport. That identifies this flight as Flight AA-77. That means no plane swap, no offloading of passengers before the Pentagon crash. That means the major effort to collect and identify the DNA of passengers in the Pentagon was a legitimate process. This is the FDR unit. This is the memory module of the FDR as it was found in the Pentagon rubble. There's another aspect to the FDR surprise. The FDR data is stored in binary form in a nearly indestructible memory module by the FDR device as it records the flight of the plane. That memory module was found in the Pentagon rubble detached from the body of the FDR. It had been detached from the rest of the device during the multiple impacts with columns as it crashed through the building. It is like a thumb drive being pulled out of your computer while it is in the midst of writing data. Warren Stutt, who is a software engineer, gave a concise description of the data layout at the 2019 Denver Conference on the 9/11 Pentagon Evidence, which you can find on the Scientists for 9/11 Truth website and on my website, 911speakout.org. What I am presenting here is a simplified version. The data is structured into 4-second frames, each ending with a checksum to validate the data and a line of code to enable single-bit error corrections. If the error detection scheme determines that an error was made that was not a single-bit error, it rejects the frame entirely. When an FDR is recovered, the data is passed through software provided by the manufacturer that reads the binary data and translates it into a human-readable spreadsheet format. The problem that occurred in the FDR recovered at the Pentagon, and which was not recognized initially, was that the last frame of binary data was rejected by the reader software and never written to the spreadsheet. No one knew it was there. Breaking off the memory module and thus terminating the data stream prematurely prevented the checksum and error correction code from being written for the last frame. The FOIA responses to requests for the data contained both the raw binary data and the human-readable spreadsheet. What it showed in the final frame on the spreadsheet was that the plane was too high to hit the Pentagon. This bolstered the view for a while that the plane had flown over the Pentagon. It took several years and deep probing by several researchers to realize that there was an additional partial frame of data in the binary file, but it couldn't be read with the standard software because without the error correction codes, the last frame would be rejected. What Warren Stutt did was to create his own program to read and translate the binary data while working around the lack of error codes. When he ran the normal data through his program, he got results identical with the commercial software. He then tested the last frame in two different ways. One way was to have the software ignore the error correction codes and translate the data as is. The other way was to manually compute the appropriate error correction codes for the last frame and add it to the data and then feed it through the standard reader. Both methods produced identical results, so that validates there was nothing wrong with the data apart from the missing error codes. Without the final frame, the plane was stuck high in the air back near the Navy Annex. With the final frame restored, the plane is shown coming all the way down to the entrance hole in the Pentagon wall. The very last data point in the restored data shows a sudden, extremely large backward acceleration and a large leftward acceleration indicating that it suffered impacts on the front and right sides of the plane. Think about it. How plausible is it that the FDR data was faked? The manufacturer's software rejected the last frame entirely as being unreadable. Therefore, it remained unread. That last frame covers 4 seconds, which includes everything from the Navy Annex to the Pentagon wall. Anyone trying to fake this data would be flying blind. Matching the exact circumstances of the final impact would be out of the question. Even specifying the height of the entrance hole would be guesswork at best. Providing the direction of motion that precisely links the points of contact at the overpass with the points of contact at the generator trailer and retaining wall would also be incredible in the sense of not credible. To even imagine conjuring up that kind of computation and then to omit the error codes in the last frame, making that data unreadable, even by the software, and thus unavailable in the human-readable file, is unbelievable. If the government wanted the data to show a plane crash that never took place, why would they provide FDR data that failed to show the final seconds of the flight and leave people doubting whether an impact occurred at all? Why would they show position data with the data drift that had to be corrected to align with the hole? Nothing about the FDR data seems tailored to fit a propaganda narrative. Discovering the true meaning of the FDR data required the amazing talents of someone like Warren Stutt and the combined efforts of a number of other researchers. The sudden, premature detachment of the memory module from the base of the unit accounted for the exact nature of the errors Warren had found in the data itself. This is not propaganda data. This is data that corresponds with reality. We are looking at real data untouched by human hands. None of what I have said here today is a result of believing the government narrative. It's a result of following the evidence. When there is a question of authenticity, I have looked to the data itself to judge its internal consistency and look for evidence of fakery. What I found instead was internal consistency and close correspondence of the data with the facts on the ground. What I did not find were proof of or even plausibility of fakery. It is my contention that it is time for the 9/11 truth movement to become a truth movement. We need to set aside the years of accumulated mythology and speculation and coalesce around the hard evidence, just like what happened at the World Trade Center. Commercial flights with passengers on board were crashed into buildings. We are seeing here the results of Flight AA-77, which similarly crashed into the Pentagon. Does this align with the government narrative? Yes, there was a 757 with people on board. But no, it was not a surprise attack. It was an inside job. The best evidence for that is the events at the World Trade Center were clearly a product of an inside job, and the Pentagon was part of the same operation. But whether or not our conclusions overlap with the government narrative isn't the point. This research is not being driven by a narrative or a counter-narrative. This is research guided by the evidence, and what I have shown you here today is what the evidence shows.